Hi gang, if you saw my teacup video, then you definitely want to watch this one because this is an accessory for this. This is the cookie teaspoons that go with it. If you haven't seen the teacup video, then watch this and go promptly watch that one because they're designed as a set. What you see before you is all cookie and icing, little teaspoons, with very little icing in fact. So this is a really quick project. All you need for this project are basically 2 cookie pieces, the bowl of the spoon, and I'll be showing you how to shape that in a bit because it's a little bit different, and the handle of the spoon, which is actually what's called a Franken cookie. I've actually morphed 2 separate cookie pieces together, baked them in the oven, and they fused into one continuous handle. And I'm going to also be showing you how to do that. Now, depending on the sizes of molds and spoons you use to shape these pieces, you can end up with something very dainty like this Demitasse spoon here, or you can end up with something that's more like a normal teaspoon size. I'm going to be working with the small pieces today because I think they look beautiful with my teacups. So let's talk first about shaping. Ready to roll, so to speak. And that's what we're doing. I'm going to roll out my gingerbread about 1/8 of an inch thick. You could probably use a sugar cookie dough just as well for this because these shapes aren't particularly contoured. I tend to work with my gingerbread dough on really curvy shapes because it doesn't spread much at all, but I think my sugar cookie dough would work just as well for this one. So I'm going to start by cutting the handle, and I'm using a 2-inch cookie cutter, little plaque cutter from Cookie Cutter Kingdom, and I'll have all the sources in my video description if you fail to miss them in the video. So this is going to form the bottom of the handle with a little bit of additional cutting. I want to save that piece because we're going to cut the stem of the handle from it. And you'll notice I just trimmed it in a little on the edges to make it a little more tapered at the top. This is called Franken cooking. Franken cooking. Morphing a very different type of cookie out of different cookie shapes. I don't know who coined that term in the cookie industry, but somebody did and it's stuck. Okay, so now I want to add the little stem. And this is no more than about 1/4 of an inch wide and maybe 1 inch to 1.25 inches long. And again, I'll have all the dimensions in the video description. And you can size them any which way you want. These are for the small Demitasse cup size spoon. So now, simply to Franken cookie, you could use a little bit of water there or an egg wash, but I find that these actually usually fuse together quite well, just bake together in the oven. If I just stick them and lightly tap them together, I managed to stretch my handle out a little in the process. You can see why you wouldn't want to move this, though, from your work surface onto another cookie sheet at this point. So I just want to get it really straight at this point, because however I have it arranged here is what it's going to look like when it's baked. I'm going to just trim that down to an appropriate length. There's a little extra here that I want to carve out. But I think that looks pretty good. And that's how I would do the handle. I do a bunch of them, as many as I can fit conveniently on one silicone mat. Usually I work around the periphery because it's hard to work in the middle of something once you have cookies on the edge. And I just put it on the back side of my cookie sheet, stick it in the oven, and it's ready to bake. So let's talk about how I actually shape the spoon, the bowl of the spoon. I actually work with real spoons as my molds. These are obviously oven proof. It's not going to hurt them to go in the oven. This has been in a few times now, at least a few times, to make the cookies for this project. But I'm using them much as I would any of my silicone baking molds. I'm just pressing the dough into them till it comes up to the edge of the spoon. So I don't need a lot. I want this to be pretty thin so it looks like a real spoon. I don't want to put a big chunk of dough in there. So you can see how little I put in. The other thing I do is I just use my fingers to kind of smooth around the edge so it's nice and smooth before it goes in the oven. I can file it a little bit when it comes out with my microplaner if it's a little bit rough. But the less I have to do that, the better. Then this would go into the oven, as many as I can fit on a sheet tray, bake at its normal baking temperature. The only thing that I do differently with this particular piece is that if it tends to rise at all in the oven, as soon as it comes out of the oven, I'll put another spoon of the same size, nest it on top, and gently press it into the dough and just flatten it out. And that will return it to this nice, smooth, sort of concave profile. Here's a fully baked piece. And they should slip right out. If you have any difficulty with that, again, while they're warm from the oven, just take the tip of a fine bladed paring knife and get an edge and it'll pop right out. So we're back to assemble these pieces, and that's a pretty straightforward process. You'll see they've baked and they've fused together. So I'm now working not with 3 pieces, but 2. I'm just going to put a little thick brown royal icing glue. Remember, that's my very thickest consistency because the thicker it is, the faster it'll dry. I'm just going to put it at the tip here, and if you need to prop the spoon up, I don't seem to need to here. But if you do, a little bit of paper towel underneath will keep that in place until the icing dries. One thing I want to do at this phase is to make sure I knock off any extra royal icing from the edges because we don't want that to show up when we actually spray the piece in the end. We don't want any lumpy icing there. Okay, so that's good. I'd let that dry at least a half an hour until it dries completely. I can pick it up and move it like so. Now the next step is to add detail to it so it looks a little more fancy. So here's an example of one that I've piped already. Chosen kind of a gold color to match the gingerbread, but almost any color could work because we're going to spray over it later and it's going to mask the underlying color. So let's see what we're going to do here. I'm going to start with some thick royal icing that's, again, that gold consistency, and I've got a number 25 tip in here to make some little small flourishes like these at the ends of the spoons. I'm going to start with, I believe, with those. And this is basically a little shell accent. So I just push forward and pull back like so. And I'm going to do that in 3 places at the end here. Make a slightly different style of spoon than the one that you have in front of you. So now I'm going to move from my metal tip, which creates a lot of texture, to just a straight cut across the end of my parchment cone to create nice thin lines for detailing down the center and around the edges. I'm using icing of roughly the same consistency as what I used. It's fairly thick, so it holds a nice tight line. I'm just going to do a couple little lines like so to highlight the handle, sweep, if you will, the curves on the handle. And some simple little lines across here. Starting a little bit off the cardboard here just so I make contact. All the way, the icing makes contact with the cookie all the way around it. So I'd like to start off the edge a little bit, and then we'll push it into that icing a little bit. Okay, and then I'm going to move to one last texture of icing, which is my icing of beadwork consistency, which is relatively loose. It forms a nice rounded dot on its own without a lot of effort. I've added about 2 to 3 tablespoons of water to each cup of my icing glue to get it that consistency. And I'm going to use that just to add a few little flourishes to this. This will be a relatively simple spoon as compared to some of the ones I've piped up there. The other thing I like to do with the dot work icing is to cover any seams, like where I've got ends of piping. I'm just going to push some really big dots here off to the edge. That'll look nice. And again, highlight the contour of the handle. One here at the seam. And then I think I'm going to do some tiny ones up either side of this line. Here I've got the cone with the same opening, of course, as I just made those big dots with. I'm just pushing ever so gently so I get a very different amount of icing coming out of it, a much more dainty dot. And I'm just going to do some up the sides here as well. I think the only other place I want to add some dots is right down here, where there's a joint that's kind of showing, because that'll show up more when I actually spray the piece. But I think that looks pretty good. You want that to dry completely before you spray it. We're going to be spraying it with a canned luster spray, a PME, either a gold or a pearl, which will look silver, and they come out with some force, so it could blow your spoon apart if it's not completely dry. Okay, before we spray the spoon, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the edible sprays I'm using. The last time I used them in a video, it created a lot of hoopla because people were thinking I was spraying something inedible onto the cookie, and I'm not. These are edible luster sprays. They're nothing more than food coloring and alcohol that's used to sort of suspend the food coloring in it. The alcohol evaporates very quickly once sprayed, and you're just left with this very nice shiny luster. I'm working with a pearl to create the silver effect. I've set up my backdrop, as I always do, because this spray goes everywhere. And typically, if I'm doing a lot of spraying, I'll actually set up a Cake Safe brand hood that is a ventilation system, and it'll suck out the spray. You spray into it, and it removes, all airborne stuff. So here I'm not covered over top, so things may rise. Just going to give it a quick shake, good shake, I should say, and spray. And this comes out with some force, so I want to do it at some distance so I don't cause this thing to fly, and I may actually put my finger on the end. You could airbrush with similar kinds of colors, sheens, and that you have a little more control there because it doesn't come out with quite such force. And it's not quite as airborne. You can see it's surrounding me. I like to get it from all sides, and eventually we'll flip it over and also get the back. And you could stop here with spraying and you see a little bit of the gold icing sort of peeking through. It gives it kind of an antique look. Or I could continue to spray more heavily and get it more heavily pearlized, and you'd almost see none of that underlying icing. You want to be careful with that. You don't want to get too close because the spray can start pooling up and it won't look as attractive. So I'm just going to flip that over and get a little bit of the back of the spoon as well. Okay, so there it's all sprayed. It looks very lifelike, but it's completely edible. One note, you want to wait a few minutes before you handle it. The alcohol will evaporate very quickly, and so the food coloring will therefore dry very quickly. But if you handle it too soon, while there's any moisture appearing on the cookie piece, you can leave fingerprints, and we don't want that. But once it's dry, you can lift it up and place it wherever you want, and they look just beautiful as a set. They're completely edible and enjoyable as they are, but I assure you they're going to look all that much more spectacular and taste that much better when paired with my 3D cookie teacups and saucers, which are coming up in my next video. Till then, live sweetly.